If the payment is not received by the last deadline on Monday the 9th at 5 p.m., she will be killed.
It's a very active investigation. We've got a lot of work ahead of us. We've done a lot of work, but we still have more.
Even though
someone knows something, we want that person to call us. We need that phone call.
6 months. That's how long Nancy Guthrie has been gone. 6 months since an 84-year-old mother vanished from her own bedroom in the middle of the night. The garage door closing at 9:50 p.m., her doorbell camera going dark 2 hours later, and by morning, nothing. No body, no suspect, no answers. Her daughter, a woman millions of Americans wake up to every single day on national television, has spent half a year begging the public for one name, one tip, one piece of the puzzle that breaks this case wide open. And then, just days ago, 2 letters surfaced. Ransom notes. Investigators say one demanding millions in cryptocurrency, the other an apology. A confession that Nancy didn't survive, that she was, in the kidnapper's own words, buried in nature now. But here's what almost nobody is talking about. Less than 24 hours after those letters became public, the FBI went back. Not to the house, not to the driveway where cameras and press have camped for months. They went into the desert brush behind her home. The same agents. The same stretch of land they've already searched, more than once. Investigators believe Arizona's monsoon season may have torn through that ground and shifted something buried, hidden, or simply missed the first time. Why go back to a place they've already been? What do they know now that they didn't know 6 months ago? And why, after everything, does the answer to where Nancy Guthrie is still seem to be hiding in her own backyard? Before we go back through everything investigators know and everything they still can't explain, let us know in the comments where you're watching this from tonight. We've had people tuning in from every state and honestly from around the world following this case with us. And if this is your first time here, hit subscribe because this investigation is nowhere near over and neither are we. Now, to understand why the FBI is back behind that house, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to the last normal night of Nancy Guthrie's life. Tucson, Arizona. The Catalina Foothills. A neighborhood of wide desert lots, low adobe walls, and the kind of quiet that makes strangers stand out. This isn't a place with sidewalks on every block or streetlights on every corner. It's a place where neighbors know the sound of each other's cars, where the desert itself presses right up against people's backyards, and where, for decades, nothing more dramatic than a monsoon storm ever disturbed the peace. Nancy Guthrie had lived in this house since the 1970s. Decades of memories built into a backyard framed by saguaro cactus and hard-packed desert brush. A pool. A little guest casita tucked beside the main house. The kind of home a family returns to, generation after generation, for holidays and Sunday dinners. It was also, investigators would come to realize, a house without a fortress around it. No towering security wall, no guard gate at the end of the driveway. Just a modest desert home belonging to a woman who, to her neighbors, was simply Nancy. Warm, familiar, and utterly unaware that anyone in the world might be watching her. On the night of January 31st, that's exactly what was happening. Nancy's family dropped her off at home sometime between 9:30 and 9:45 in the evening. Ordinary. Routine. The kind of goodbye nobody thinks twice about, because there's no reason to. At 9:50 p.m., her garage door closed behind her. And then, according to investigators, the house goes quiet for less than 4 hours. At 1:47 in the morning, Nancy's Google Nest doorbell camera disconnects. 25 minutes later, at 2:12 a.m., one of the home's other cameras detects motion, a person. But there's no footage to go with it. The system wasn't set up to record and store that clip, and by the time anyone thought to look, it was already gone. Then, at 2:28 a.m., something happens that investigators would come to see as one of the most chilling data points in the entire case. Nancy Guthrie wore a pacemaker, and that pacemaker was connected, through an app, to her phone. At 2:28 in the morning, that connection drops. Silently. No alarm. No warning to anyone. Just a quiet disconnection between a dying signal and an empty house, logged in a database that nobody would look at again until it was already too late to matter. For the rest of that night, nothing. No calls, no movement, no sign that anything at all was wrong. It isn't until late the next morning, 11:56 a.m., that Nancy's family realizes something is off. She's missed her weekly ritual, a small group gathering where she watched her church's live-streamed service with friends. Nancy never missed it. Not for illness, not for travel. It was sacred to her. By 12:03 p.m., the family calls 911. By 12:15, sheriff's deputies are standing in her driveway. And what they find in the next few minutes will set off a chain of events that 6 months later, the FBI is still trying to fully understand. There is blood in the front of the house. Not a smear, not a trace. Enough blood that, decades from now, investigators who worked this case will still remember exactly how much of it there was. And here's where the first mistake happens, a mistake that would haunt this investigation for months to come. The responding deputies look at that blood, and they make an assumption. Nancy was elderly. She was on blood thinners. The property was surrounded by cactus, sharp, unforgiving, capable of opening skin with the slightest brush of contact. So the deputies reason, maybe this is old blood. Maybe Nancy had a nosebleed. Maybe this has nothing to do with why she isn't answering her door. It is, on paper, a reasonable theory. Elderly people on blood thinners can bleed dramatically from something as small as a scratch. But it was also, investigators would later admit, wrong. And that single wrong assumption, that this was just an innocent event, cost this investigation something it can never get back: time and an untouched crime scene. Because while deputies were still trying to decide whether this was a missing person or a medical mystery, life around that house kept moving. Cars kept pulling in and out of the circular driveway. Family members walked the property. Nobody had yet said the words that needed to be said out loud. This is a crime scene. Lock it down. As deputies moved through the property that first day, the small details started stacking up, one on top of another, each one making the "she just wandered off" theory harder and harder to believe. Nancy's car was still there. Her Apple Watch was found at the end of her bed, and her bed itself hadn't been made. To most people, an unmade bed means nothing, but to Nancy's family, it meant everything. Because Nancy Guthrie did not leave her house without making her bed. Not once. Not ever. It was one of those small, unshakable habits that define a person, and on this particular morning, that habit had been broken. Then there was the back of the house. Behind the pool, past the covered patio, there's a side door. Not the sliding glass door many people initially assumed, but a simple door with glass panes near the top, and next to it, a screen door leading out toward the caseta. Investigators say that door was propped open, not blown open, not broken, propped, deliberately, with 2 potted plants moved into position to hold it in place. Savannah Guthrie would later say, in her own words, that doors, plural, were propped open that night, a small detail. But in an investigation built entirely out of small details, it's one that never stopped mattering. Because here's the question that has haunted this case since day one. Did whoever came for Nancy Guthrie enter through the back? Did they leave through it? Was this door propped open by Nancy herself hours earlier for some innocent reason lost to time? Or was it propped open by someone who wanted a clean, quiet way in and out of a house they had already studied? Now overlay that question with what came next, the doorbell footage. It would take days, nearly 10 of them, before investigators had anything close to an answer. Nancy's Nest doorbell camera had disconnected at 1:47 a.m., but Google's engineers were eventually able to recover residual data buried deep in the camera's back-end systems. Data that was never meant to be recovered. Data that almost stayed lost forever. And what that data showed changed everything. A masked figure, full face covering, gloves so thick, investigators would later note that the person struggled to move their own fingers. A backpack. a flashlight gripped in their mouth, freeing both hands. And on the front of their belt, what analysts believe was a holstered gun. The figure approaches the door, raises a gloved hand and presses it directly over the camera lens. Then, and this is the detail that turns your stomach the more you think about it, they walk away, gather nearby plants, and brush from the property itself, and use them to physically block the camera's view. Not panicked, not rushed, calm. Methodical. A behavioral analyst who reviewed the footage would later describe the person's composure as almost unnatural. The kind of calm, she said, that comes from only two places: a person's core personality or first-hand experience doing something like this before. And then comes the detail that should make your skin crawl. Investigators later confirmed that one of the images captured on that camera was taken on a different date than the others, not the night Nancy disappeared, before it, which means, according to law enforcement sources, this was not a single moment of opportunity. This was reconnaissance. Someone had been to that house before. Someone had studied that camera, studied that doorway, studied the woman who lived behind it, and then came back to finish what they'd started planning. Whoever this was, they didn't stumble onto Nancy Guthrie's home in the dark. They already knew it. Think about what that actually means. For 10 agonizing days, Nancy Guthrie's family had almost nothing. No footage, no suspect. No idea whether they were searching for a living woman or investigating a murder. Search teams combed the desert on foot, carrying water bottles against the Arizona heat, walking through rock and brush and cactus, looking for any sign of her. Volunteers joined law enforcement in that search, walking grid patterns across miles of unforgiving terrain. Because in the earliest days of a missing person case, every single hour matters, and nobody wanted to waste one of them. And then on day 10, that footage finally surfaced, recovered from data investigators weren't even sure still existed. FBI Director Kash Patel announced it directly, calling it a breakthrough the case had been waiting for. And for a moment, it felt like the beginning of an answer. Instead, it became one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence the public has ever seen in a missing persons case, because it proved, beyond any doubt, that this wasn't random. This wasn't an accident, a wandering elderly woman, an innocent explanation. Someone had planned this. Someone had studied this house, studied this camera, studied this family, and then walked up to that door in the dead of night with a weapon on their belt. In the days that followed, investigators searched Nancy's property with a level of scrutiny most homes never see. A blue SUV was towed out of her garage to an impound lot, examined for anything that might connect it to her disappearance. A drone captured FBI agents on the roof itself, removing what looked like a white cylindrical device from a ledge overlooking the courtyard. Its purpose never fully explained to the public, and investigators say DNA was recovered from inside the home itself. DNA that, 6 months later, is still being processed, still being compared, still, as far as the public knows, unmatched to anyone. But by then, the damage to the crime scene had already been done. Retired FBI agents who've reviewed this case, agents with decades of experience processing violent crime scenes, have been blunt about what went wrong in those first critical hours. And what they describe is difficult to hear because it means some of the answers this family is still searching for may have been available from the very beginning and lost before anyone realized what they were looking at. When deputies first arrived, this circular driveway, the one right in front of Nancy's home, was never fully secured. Cars kept coming and going. Family members walked the property looking for her. Nobody had yet drawn the line that separates a missing person's house from an active crime scene. According to investigators with decades of crime scene experience, that decision should have happened almost immediately. The moment the blood was found, the moment the propped open door, the untouched bed, the missing watch, and the still parked car all lined up together, that property needed to be sealed off. Not just the house, not just the driveway. The entire perimeter stretching back toward the casita should have been locked down and treated as evidence. Instead, by the time the FBI's evidence response team walked the property in the deliberate, methodical line search that crime scene units use to comb for shoe prints, tire tracks, and physical evidence. The kind of search where investigators stand shoulder to shoulder and move forward inch by inch. Days had already passed. Days in which people had been allowed to walk across the very ground investigators would later need untouched. Whatever was in that dirt on February 1st, a partial footprint, a fiber, a drop of blood not yet degraded by heat and time, may not be there anymore. Or it may have been walked over, driven over, and lost before anyone in a position to preserve it understood what they were standing on. This is the wound at the center of the Nancy Guthrie investigation. Not just that a woman disappeared, but that the very ground that might explain how and who may have already given up its secrets to careless footsteps before the right people ever arrived to listen. And it's exactly why, 6 months later, investigators are still going back, still searching, still trying to recover what might have been lost the first time. Here's what should terrify anyone following this case. In a neighborhood with cameras at nearly every intersection, at gas stations, at choke points where traffic naturally funnels in and out, investigators have never been able to tie a single vehicle to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. Not one. No unfamiliar car caught driving past a nearby Circle K. No suspicious vehicle flagged at any of the two main choke points leading in and out of the neighborhood. The very points where, if you wanted to watch who was coming and going, you'd park a surveillance camera. Nothing. For investigators, that absence isn't just a dead end. It's a clue in itself. Because it suggests something deeply uncomfortable. Whoever did this either walked or was already close enough to Nancy's home that a car was never needed at all. That single detail keeps pulling this investigation back to one place, again and again. The neighborhood itself. The people who live there. The paths behind the houses that residents have used for decades. Dirt trails and narrow passages that cut between properties. The same trails neighborhood kids used to run through as children, sneaking from backyard to backyard in the dark. It's the same stretch of land the FBI is combing through right now. In the days after Nancy vanished, a man living at a property that was searched by authorities was detained and questioned. His car was searched. His home was searched. And then, he was released. No charges. No arrest. Just another name crossed off a list that, 6 months later, still doesn't have an ending. FBI Director Kash Patel has said publicly that the agency is looking at persons of interest, plural, in this case. But naming names, even privately held suspicions, is something law enforcement almost never does before they're certain. Retired agents who've spent careers on cases like this one say it plainly. You cannot accuse someone without airtight evidence. You will be sued. The case will be compromised. So even if investigators have a strong theory about who did this, the public may not hear that name for months or years, or possibly never, if this case follows the pattern of others like it. And there have been other cases like it. Cases where the public and the press were certain they knew who was responsible, certain enough to destroy that person's life in the court of public opinion, only to be proven catastrophically wrong when the real offender was finally found. It's the reason law enforcement moves with such maddening caution in cases like this one. Because being fast and being right are not always the same thing. And once you've accused an innocent person, you can never fully take it back. So for 6 months, that's where this case sat. A masked figure with no name. A home with no answers. A family clinging to the last thing anyone can offer them in a case like this. Hope. And a reward that has since climbed into 7 figures for anyone with real information. There's one detail in this timeline that investigators keep circling back to, almost reluctantly, because of what it might mean. Not long before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, Savannah had been in Tucson with her mother, filming a segment for the Today Show, a quiet, personal piece. The kind of story that airs for a few minutes and is forgotten by most viewers within the hour. Except this time, it wasn't forgotten. Because weeks, maybe even days, after that segment aired, revealing to millions of people exactly where Nancy Guthrie lived, she vanished. Investigators are careful about coincidence. Most of the time, it's exactly that. Coincidence Nothing more. But on a serious investigative timeline, one that lines up every data point from the 6 months before Nancy disappeared to the moment deputies arrived at her door, that segment airing is a marker nobody can afford to ignore. Because if someone had been trying, quietly, for months or even years, to get close to Savannah Guthrie and failing every time, breaching the layers of security that come with being on national television every morning, that broadcast may have handed them the one thing they never had: an address. A retired federal profiler who has studied this case since the beginning has said publicly that he hopes, and assumes, investigators have gone back through Savannah's emails, her phone records, every call that's ever come into the Today Show newsroom, looking for a name that surfaces again and again. Someone obsessed, someone who wrote too much, or someone who suddenly, suspiciously, stopped writing at all the moment Nancy disappeared. Because in cases like this one, silence can be as loud as a confession. We're halfway through everything we know about this case, and what comes next is the part that changed this investigation completely. But before we get into the ransom notes and what one retired FBI agent believes they reveal about this family's darkest 6 months, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching this from tonight. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who care about bringing Nancy home. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because we are staying on this case until there's an answer. For months, the Nancy Guthrie case moved in near silence. Tips came in. Investigators followed them. But publicly, there was nothing new. No arrest, no answer, no sign of forward motion. And then, right around the 6-month mark, everything happened within the span of a single week. It began quietly. A local reporter came forward with something investigators had apparently been sitting on since almost the very beginning of the case: a ransom note, sent to a Tucson television station in the earliest days of the investigation and never made public. Not for 6 months. The note demanded $4 million, payable in cryptocurrency. It claimed Nancy Guthrie was alive, safe, but scared, and it warned that if the ransom wasn't paid, the amount would increase, and if it still wasn't paid, Nancy would be killed. That alone would be enough to reshape how the public understood this case. But it wasn't the only letter. A second note surfaced, and its tone was nothing like the first. Where the first note was cold and transactional, almost businesslike in its threat, the second read like an apology. Investigators say it stated, in the kidnapper's own words, that Nancy did not survive, that she was, and we're quoting the language investigators have described, buried in nature now. The note reportedly went on to say that whoever wrote it never intended to hurt her. 2 letters, 2 completely different voices. One cold and calculating. One soft, almost remorseful. At first, even seasoned investigators weren't convinced the same person had written both. The tone was too different. But that's where forensic linguistics, the science of analyzing written language for identifying patterns, entered this case in a way few people expected. A forensic linguistics expert who reviewed both notes found something the public never would have caught: the sentence structure, the comma placement, the rhythm of how each note was built, sentence by sentence. According to that analysis, both notes, despite their wildly different emotional tone, were built using nearly identical grammatical patterns, the same pauses, the same structural instincts. It was, in the expert's assessment, powerful evidence that both letters came from the same hand. Which raises a chilling possibility that this wasn't 2 different people, one cruel and one guilty. It was one person, capable of both, cold enough to demand a ransom under threat of death, and then, later, human enough to feel the weight of what they'd done. Or its manipulation. A calculated attempt to soften a grieving family, to shift the emotional register of the case just enough to make an already devastated family feel some small, false sense of closure, while giving investigators nothing they can actually act on. Because here's what's most disturbing about that second note. Even in its confession, it gives no location, no coordinates, no landmark. Just 3 words that have haunted this case ever since it became public: buried in nature. In a region as vast and unforgiving as the Arizona desert, buried in nature could mean almost anywhere. And then, around this same 6-month mark, Savannah Guthrie released a message of her own, one that, when you listen closely, contains a detail almost nobody talked about at the time. She opened by saying that her family had done our part. To retired investigators who've spent careers reading between the lines of exactly these kinds of statements, that phrase set off alarms, because it strongly implies something the public has never been told outright, that some kind of arrangement, some kind of communication, possibly even a payment, may have taken place between this family and whoever is responsible. An attempt, perhaps, to learn where Nancy's remains might be found. And if that's true, then Savannah's message wasn't just an emotional plea to the public. It was a message to one specific person. Someone who, according to one retired agent's read of the situation, had effectively already been told, "You won." And since that message went out, silence. No further contact. No new notes. No indication the family has learned anything more. Which brings this entire case back once again to the ground behind Nancy Guthrie's house. In the weeks following the release of those ransom notes, neighbors near Nancy Guthrie's home began noticing something. FBI agents, the same faces some neighbors had come to recognize after months of repeated interviews, were back. Not at the front of the house, where cameras and reporters have gathered on and off for 6 months. Behind it, there's a stretch of land back there that's hard to describe unless you've stood in it. Not quite an alley, more like an old dirt pathway, cutting between two properties, threading through thick desert brush, saguaro cactus, and rock. Power lines overhead, small burrows in the ground where local wildlife has made its home. It's the kind of terrain that, at night, would be almost impossible to move through quickly, every step risking a fall, a cut, a rattlesnake. And it's exactly where investigators have chosen to focus, not once, but multiple times since Nancy Guthrie vanished. One neighbor described watching FBI agents walking that same dirt pathway, the one running behind the house, just weeks ago. She recognized them immediately. The same agents who had come to her own door, more than once, over the past 6 months. So why go back to ground they've already searched? Investigators who've spoken about the renewed search point to two possibilities, and both of them are unsettling in their own way. The first is weather. Arizona's monsoon season brings sudden, violent rainstorms this time of year, the kind that can transform dry desert wash into a moving current of water within minutes. Retired agents who understand how evidence behaves in terrain like this explain that water doesn't just fall and disappear. It flows downhill, collects at natural choke points, and carries with it anything lightweight enough to move. Fabric, clothing, small personal items. If investigators know what Nancy was wearing the night she disappeared, and heavy rain has since cut a new path through that same stretch of land, there is a real possibility that evidence buried, hidden, or simply overlooked the first time has shifted and resurfaced somewhere new. The second theory is even more direct, that this stretch of land was always a likely point of entry and exit. Remember, the back doors of Nancy's home were propped open the night she disappeared. If whoever came for her didn't come through the front, past the doorbell camera that ultimately caught them, then the back of that property, this exact dirt pathway, this exact stretch of brush, may be the route they used instead. Which means the FBI isn't just revisiting old ground out of thoroughness. They may be searching the last place where physical evidence of Nancy Guthrie's abduction could still exist, ground that heavy rain has now disturbed, potentially exposing something that 6 months of desert heat, wind, and time had otherwise kept hidden. There's one more detail that deserves to be said plainly, because it's the kind of thing that could matter to anyone who's ever passed this family in a grocery store, sat next to them at church, or worked alongside them without a second thought. Behavioral profilers who study cases like this one look for two categories of behavior: what happens before an incident and what happens after it. Before, they look for someone quietly obsessing over a public figure, someone reaching out again and again, someone who won't take no for an answer. After, they look for someone whose life visibly changes in the days following the crime, someone who suddenly alters their appearance, Someone who leaves town without warning, citing an emergency nobody can verify. Someone who becomes fixated on the story, or someone who goes strangely, suspiciously silent about it, when just weeks earlier, they couldn't stop talking about the Guthrie family. Retired profilers have said publicly that they were surprised this kind of behavioral profile wasn't released to the public earlier in the investigation, a tool that has helped crack major cases before. And then right around the 6-month mark, when those ransom notes finally became public, the sheriff's office released almost exactly that kind of guidance. The same behavioral markers experts had already been describing for months, now finally in the public's hands. If you know someone who fits that description, someone who changed after February 1st, someone who won't stop talking about this case, or someone who suddenly refuses to, investigators want to hear from you. Not because you should accuse anyone, but because in a case with this little physical evidence, a single observation from someone who simply noticed something wrong might be the piece that's been missing all along. And there's a deeper truth buried in why they're doing this at all. A truth that circles back to everything that went wrong in the earliest hours of this case. Because if that crime scene had been secured properly on February 1st, if the entire perimeter, all the way back to that casita and beyond, had been locked down before a single extra car or footstep crossed it, investigators might already know the answer to the question that's haunted this case for 6 straight months. Instead, they're doing now, months later, and after a monsoon season's worth of rain, what should have been done in the first 24 hours. They're looking for what should have already been found. There's something else happening quietly behind the scenes of this investigation that rarely makes headlines, but matters more than most people realize. New investigators are being rotated onto this case. Fresh detectives, new agents, people who weren't there in the first exhausting weeks, who haven't spent 6 months staring at the same reports, the same photographs, the same dead ends. Investigators who've spent careers working cases like this one say that rotation can cut 2 ways. It can be frustrating, bringing in someone who has to be caught up from zero on a case this complex, but it can also be exactly what a stalled investigation needs. A new detective with a background in digital forensics might catch something a narcotics-trained investigator would miss entirely. Someone who's spent a career chasing informants on the street might notice a gap in the tip line nobody else thought to follow up on. Sometimes, the answer isn't more evidence. It's someone new finally looking at the evidence that's already there. And 6 months in, with the reward climbing into 7 figures, 2 ransom notes finally public, and federal agents back combing the same stretch of desert behind Nancy Guthrie's home, this case may finally be entering the moment investigators have been hoping for since February, the moment someone, somewhere, decides they can't stay quiet any longer. 6 months, 2 ransom notes, a masked figure caught on camera who was never identified, a crime scene that may have given up its answers before anyone realized what they were looking at, and now, federal agents combing the same stretch of desert brush behind Nancy Guthrie's home, hoping the rain gave up what 6 months of silence never did. As of tonight, there's still no arrest, no confirmed location, no official word on what, if anything, that renewed search has found. What we do know is this. Somewhere in the Catalina Foothills, behind a house where a family built decades of memories, the answer to what happened to Nancy Guthrie may still be sitting in the ground, waiting for the right storm, the right search, or the right person to finally come forward. If you know anything at all, about what happened to Nancy Guthrie the night she disappeared, investigators are still listening. You can call 1-800-CALL-FBI or the Pima County Sheriff's Tip Line at 1-520-351-4900. It only takes one call to change everything for this family. Before you go, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We read every single one, and it means more than you know to see how many people around the world are still following this case with us. If this is the first video of ours you've watched, subscribe, because we cover cases like this one every single week, and we don't stop until there's an answer. Nancy Guthrie has been gone for 6 months. Somewhere, someone knows why. and the ground behind her house might be the last thing standing between this family and the truth.